Okay, so welcome particularly to this session that is entitled Colonial Legacies, Statues and Black Lives Matter. So it's only 4 weeks ago today that George Floyd, an African-American man, was murdered by the police in the USA. And we're all aware that that unleashed a huge wave of anger and pain and protest around the world, as well, I think it's fair to say, is a great deal of reflection. Now, I know a lot of you here have been reading and learning and thinking and listening and sharing with each other about a whole range of issues around Black Lives Matter. And I had a very helpful conversation a couple of weeks ago with some of our students of colour, and we discussed how best to engage with this in the context of St Chad's College. And as we've acknowledged in various emails, we as a community have high ideals, but we know that we fall very far short of those when it comes to matters of racism and anti-racism. We've got a lot of work to do. But as we talked, our students thought it would be a good place to start would be the kind of conversation that we've organised for this evening, a conversation that engages with the history of empire and slavery, how we memorialise that in various ways, and how all of that relates to Black Lives Matter, both here and in the USA. And so what we hope from this conversation is that it will contribute to all the many conversations and reflection that's already going on, and that will teach us more about the historical and global context of racism. And we also hope that it will help us here as individuals, but also as a college, to change. Now, I'm delighted that we have three speakers with us this evening who have thought and researched and taught a lot about some of the issues here. And I'll just introduce them briefly in the order in which I've asked them to speak, which is a kind of historical order, really. So first off, we're going to hear from Jake Richards, who's an assistant professor of history here at Durham University, a historian of slavery and emancipation, who's involved in projects that look at the historical legacies of slavery in institutions, including museums and universities. And then after Jake, we'll be hearing from Anne Heffernan, who's an assistant professor also in history here at Durham. And Anne's a historian of modern South and Southern Africa. And her work focuses on the role of students and young people in influencing political trends and changes. And she's especially interested, and this is one of the reasons we wanted her to talk to us tonight, about protest politics and the development of new forms of political ideology and practice. And then finally, we're hearing Ivy George, who's not a historian, a sociologist who works in the USA, and whose research and teaching has focused on gender, religion, race, ethnicity, globalization, and social change. And she's taught mostly in the US for many years, but also in the UK and Kenya and South Africa. So we're thrilled to have these three speakers with their different perspectives. And to start off, I'd like to invite Jake to begin for us. So over to you, Jake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially to the students who suggested that this event would be a great thing to happen. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about history and about white supremacy. And I suppose really what I want the take-home message from my remarks to be is that we want to think carefully about the framing for our discussions and for the kind of work that now needs to happen. And really, as part of that framing, what I want to suggest to you is that it might be more helpful to think about slavery, about empire, and about the statue wars as part of a long and complex system of white supremacy, rather than as a set of historical legacies that somehow happened in the past and have only just left a small trace to the present. Instead, if we think of this as a system that evolves and changes and is still with us, that might help us understand exactly the scale of what we're up against and the scale of things that will need to change. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about Atlantic slavery, and then I'll end with some remarks about statues. And I'm going to try and make this a kind of usable past, a discussion where you're going to have some tools for things that you might want to think about going forwards. So a brief history then of Atlantic slavery, which involved all 4 continents in the Atlantic world: Europe, Africa, South America, and North America, and of course the Caribbean in between those latter 2. From around 1415, when the Portuguese first start developing plantation-based slavery on the islands off West Africa, right through until 1888, when Brazil becomes the last Atlantic state to abolish racial slavery in the Atlantic world. So one of the first things to emphasize in the system of Atlantic slavery is that Africans were always enslaved in what was ultimately a violent process. The majority were captured in warfare between African polities, smaller communities and organizations and societies, or through punishment for a crime, or for debt, that if they or a relative had become indebted, that it was seen as a legitimate punishment to enslave either that person or their relative to repay that debt. So I think the first thing to point out in this usable past is that when you see in public discourse things about African slavery, Africans enslaved other Africans and it was kind of a legitimate system and that it was sort of natural to Africa, well, there are a couple of things that we need to unpack there. The first being that actually enslavement wasn't natural, it was always a violent process. And the second being that actually in this time period between the 1400s and 1800s, people didn't think of themselves necessarily as African, that they lived in smaller societies which were then attacked by outsiders and subjected them to capture and warfare. So it wasn't, from their point of view, what had happened to them wasn't legitimate. Well, once those captives had been embarked on slave ships and arrived in the Americas, they were subject to all kinds of labor in the Atlantic world, both in urban areas and in rural areas. And I guess you're most familiar with the image of plantation labor. So in the Americas, enslaved people grew all manner of commodities, principally sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. And when we think about what was distinctive about this system, I think there are sort of 3 features that make Atlantic slavery a particularly distinctive form of slavery. And again, as a kind of useful pass, I want to signal these 3 features, because one of the other things we often see in public discourse is, well, Atlantic slavery wasn't that bad, that there were all sorts of societies had slaves, the Romans had slaves, the Greek had slaves, what's the big difference? And I think there were really 3 features that made Atlantic slavery a particularly exploitative system. So the first is that the primary use of enslaved people was their economic value. The fact that this was ultimately an extractive system about turning particular units of enslaved labor into commodities that could then be exported. That contrasts with lots of other systems of slavery, whereby what someone did when they enslaved other people was often about enhancing their own honor, the honor of their own household. It was about having more children, often with multiple enslaved wives or women, and often about then trying to incorporate those people into their own household. The second key feature that made Atlantic slavery different was the color line, the fact that white people were exempt from slavery and that people of African descent were subject to it, and that enslavement was then hereditable through the mother's line. So if an enslaved woman had a child, that child would be enslaved. And it was very difficult for anyone who had African heritage to escape from slavery. And that was a system that was bolstered in law, in society, in intellectual traditions right across the Atlantic world. I think the third key feature is thinking about population. So in a lot of the Americas, the enslaved population was over 50% of the total population of those societies. And in some of the most extreme cases, like Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, where there's a revolution that forms Haiti, a slave revolution essentially that forms Haiti, that population reached 85 or 90% of the population. And that contrasts with examples from the Greek or Roman world, where slaves were often around a third of the population. So these three features then of economic exploitation, the colour line, and extreme population imbalances are what really made the Atlantic slavery in the Americas side of things completely unusual and distinct. In terms of then thinking about how that develops over time, well, I think, you know, it's not just about commodity markets, it's also about the fact that all sorts of related industries were affected by slavery. And that's something that we've seen come out in the statue wars, that it's not just about the people that were involved in the slave trade or owning enslaved people, but it was also about people involved in maritime insurance for slave ships, or the early banking industry, or credit markets. And that actually lasts long after British abolition in 1807 of the slave trade and the emancipation of slaves, or certain slaves, in 1834. So, for example, in Cuba and Brazil, British banks were involved in financing the railways that expand the coffee and sugar markets right across southern Brazil and central Cuba into the 1850s and 60s. And there are other examples like that. I think it's also important, though, that when we think about this kind of onward connection, that we don't just reduce slavery to its economic and financial aspects, that we also think about the impact that slavery had intellectually, culturally, psychologically on the Atlantic world. So to give you an example, the fact that race science, sort of pseudosciences about measuring people, really grow after the abolition of British slavery. But really in the British world, a lot of those racial science traditions grow up in the 1840s and 50s and have a long kind of heritage right through to the present day. So there are plenty of examples of geneticists and statisticians who try and classify groups of people by biological race, even when there's no evidence for that, but classifying people according to biological race, and then measuring them according to some, you know, individual ranking measure. So it used to be skull size, and now it's, say, IQ, but this sort of constant attempt to measure races and the performance of races is something that has really grown up and is still with us in our intellectual traditions today. I'll just say a sort of final thing about statues, which is that I think it's important to think about statues as really one symptom of what I've outlined here as a sort of 400, 500 year system of white supremacy. I think, first of all, it's important to remember that statues are fundamentally about memorialization, about creating public myths and public memories. They're not about historical data. There aren't many historians, or really any historians, who go around studying statues to kind of work out what happens in the past. Statues are fundamentally about shaping our public space and our public life. And to give you an idea about what the effect of white supremacy has been on public life in Britain, in Britain today, there are around 800 public statues, and there are only 3 statues of actual Black women in, you know, across out of that number. And they are the sportsperson Kelly Holmes, the nurse Mary Seacole, and the broadcaster and politician Floella Benjamin. So in Britain, one of the kind of unthinking and sometimes consciously constructed effects of white supremacy has been a collective choice over the generations to exclude Black people, and in this example, Black women, from our public life. And I think one of the things we need to think about then is actually how do we combat that, not just in statues, but in all our institutions, and not just in memory, but in terms of how we want those institutions to affect our public life going forward. Okay, thank you very much.
Jake. Thank you, Jake. So we'll go straight on to Anne.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you, and especially to the students who've organized this. It's a fantastic event. As Margaret said, I am a historian of South Africa, and I work on comparatively recent history, but mostly on the anti-apartheid movement. Within that, I'm particularly interested in the role of young people, particularly students, and how they agitate for political change and particularly engage in new forms of protest. But today I'm not going to be speaking about my research on the anti-apartheid movement. I'm going to talk about much more recent history and touch a little bit on current events, but I think hopefully it's going to pick up some of the historical resonances in Jake's remarks. And so what I'm going to be talking about mostly today is the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the genesis of Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa and how it came to Britain. And many of you may be familiar with the term Rhodes Must Fall. You may have heard about it, particularly here in Oxford. You may know that it began in South Africa on the campus of the University of Cape Town in 2015. You may or may not know that the way that it began was when a Black student, Chumani Makwele at UCT, threw human feces, his poo, I believe, on the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which sat really in the sort of pride of place on the campus of the University of Cape Town. And so drawing on Jake's point about how we construct the public sphere and statues' role in that, I think it's worth thinking about the positioning of that statue, how it sat within the space that it occupied. And so from the perspective of UCT, it was absolutely central. It was in the middle of this main university plaza in front of the main administrative building. UCT, if you're unfamiliar with it, is situated on the kind of foothill of a mountain. So it's a very vertical, hilly campus, familiar to those of us in Durham. And the statue of Rhodes was right at the top. So he was looking out over the campus of the university, but then also beyond it to the city of Cape Town, to the townships, the Black and the colored townships beyond that on the Cape Flats, which very much symbolize the enduring spatial segregation that apartheid has left imprinted on the South African landscape. And then he's facing east, and Cape Town is in the southwesterly most part of the African continent. So Rhodes is looking eastward into the hinterland of South Africa and to the continent beyond. And that's a very conscious and intentional positioning for that statue. And so I think it symbolizes a lot to people who walk past it when that engagement is historically informed. And so I want to say just two things about Rhodes. I don't want to talk about him any more than I have to, because I don't think he should take up any more of our time this evening. But I do want to tell you two things about him and how we should be thinking about him within that sort of symbolized situation. The first is in his role as, eventually he became the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony at the end of the 19th century. Rhodes arrived in South Africa as a young Englishman. He was actually very young, 17, I think, when he arrived in the 1870s. And by that point, European conquest and colonization was already well underway and effectively largely accomplished in the country that we now know as South Africa. So Rhodes was not responsible for the colonization of South Africa, but he certainly capitalized upon that colonization. He became the Prime Minister of the Cape in the 1890s, and under his rule, he actively repressed the lives of Black Africans who lived within the Cape in a number of different ways, but one way that I want to highlight for you is by reducing the multiracial franchise that had existed in the Cape since the middle of the 19th century. So in the Cape, from 1854, there was a mixed race franchise only for men. Women were not eligible to vote in South Africa until the early and indeed mid 20th century for Black women. But Black men in the Cape could vote. Rhodes actively restricts that franchise by introducing educational restrictions to it and also property restrictions to it. Those are not specifically curtailed by race, but they overwhelmingly disproportionately affect Black men as opposed to white men in the Cape. And that really is, for him, largely a pragmatic political decision, because it's enabling him to kind of build a particular support base and restrict people who wouldn't vote for him. So that's one thing he does as Prime Minister. The other thing that Rhodes does, because he is while he is Prime Minister of the Cape, he is also concurrently the managing director of an organization called the British South Africa Company. And the British South Africa Company is basically an expansionist mercantile organization that is involved in exploring for mineral rights in Southern Africa. This was not terribly uncommon in the course of the late 19th century. The gold deposits had been discovered in the Witwatersrand in the 1880s, and this leads to a kind of gold rush in northern South Africa and the hinterland. The British South Africa Company is set up to look for similar deposits further north, an area that hasn't already been claimed by white settlers, as the Witwatersrand had by Afrikaners. So they look up on the Zimbabwean plateau. They send in columnists of settlers and basically launch an armed invasion of what is today Zimbabwe. The BSAC is responsible for two concurrent wars in South Africa in 1893 and in Zimbabwe in 1893 and in 1896. Historians disagree on the death toll in those wars, but certainly it's safe to say that tens of thousands of people died and many more were displaced. This is all under the auspices of Rhodes's management. So that's the figure who's positioned in this sort of pride of place on the campus of the University of Cape Town in 2015, when this protest movement starts. And that's the kind of legacy that Black South African students will be very familiar with as they walk past him in this space. Now, Makwele's protest was visceral, it was radical, it was very performative. I mean, throwing poo is extremely kind of affronting in a lot of ways. It affronts all of your senses. And because of that, it ignited a much larger protest movement under the banner Rhodes Must Fall. After the proverbial poo was thrown, students at UCT began to organize themselves around the removal of this statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And it became the center point of mass student protests. Thousands of students were gathering on the plaza around the statue, calling for its removal. And this goes on for several weeks until finally, after 3 weeks of sustained action, the university agrees and removes the statue in April of 2015, which is a really significant achievement. But the story doesn't end with the removal of the statue of Rhodes. And if you take away only one thing that I say tonight about Rhodes Must Fall, I hope that it will be this, and that's that the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from the UCT campus was never the singular or even the most important goal of Rhodes Must Fall. And this, I think, really speaks to what Jake was saying about statues only being a manifestation of a much deeper, more entrenched system. And the students who were involved in Rhodes Must Fall in Cape Town and who became involved in Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford were very aware of that system. So they put forward a whole range of demands to try to root out white supremacy within their universities. The statue becomes the kind of figurehead of it, the sort of pivot point. And it's the thing that is very easy to take pictures of and put in newspapers. But they're actually making a range of sort of structural demands. They were calling for the removal of symbols of white supremacy, so statues, things like renaming buildings, but they're also even more concerned, I would say, with implementing structural change to undo existing power structures in the universities. They initiate a national conversation about access to higher education in South Africa, highlighting the cost of university and how that excludes poor Black students. They challenge the still predominantly white and male characteristic of the senior professoriate. We're talking now more than 2 decades after the end of apartheid, and those demographics have not shifted nearly as much as you might think that they would. And they pushed their institutions to hire and promote more young scholars of color, and particularly women. They popularized a discourse of decolonization that grappled with racist legacies of scholarship and curricula in different fields. And I think that that's something we in British universities can absolutely and should be taking on board. What scholars are we reading in our research, in our reading lists for our courses? What voices are we putting forward, and which ones are perhaps in less obvious ways still kind of entrenching some of these deep, deep legacies? Now, RhodesMustFall had a 28-point plan that was very well articulated and had been honed over the course of the protests around the statue. I'm not going to read you all 28 points. That would be unreasonable. I'm not going to actually read you any of the 28 points. But what I want to emphasize is that for RhodesMustFall, the statue and its removal was only ever the starting point for their protest. They were looking for much more structural change. And in that regard, the struggle there continues, even though the statue has come down. Now, in my last kind of minute, I do want to say something about the particular nature of students and student protests, because Margaret asked me to speak to that specifically, and that's what my work is on. And I think the thing to say here is that it's not at all coincidental that a movement like RhodesMustFall began on a university campus, and that it then spread to university campuses throughout South Africa. In late 2015, we were in a period where more than 20 South African universities campuses were actively shut down by protesting students all around issues that had been raised and associated with the RhodesMustFall movement. It then makes the leap to a university campus here in Oxford. That happens because some South African student activists who had graduated from UCT were studying at Oxford when RhodesMustFall emerged. So they bring the movement there. That's a pretty common thing in student movements, because students operate in networks that sometimes connect different campuses and facilitate mobilization in that way. Students also, I think, have a particular facility and plasticity with political ideas and playing with new political ideologies, and also reading them against potentially older political ideologies. So if we think back to that 28-point plan that RhodesMustFall had, if you read that, it's making overt references to anti-colonial, anti-racist scholars and thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Steve Biko. But then they're also bringing in newer theoretical frameworks like Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectionality, trying to insert discourses of trans rights and things which are not in some of those older doctrines. And I think that kind of playing with ideas and bringing them together for new forms of ideology is a really interesting aspect of student protests. And these aren't traits that are exclusive to RhodesMustFall at all. Historically, as I said, I look at the anti-apartheid movement, and this kind of intellectual engagement with politics is very much characteristic of students as a group. And I think we're seeing it again now with young people protesting under, again, the banner of RhodesMustFall and Black Lives Matter together. That's it for me, I think, for now.
Thank you very much. Okay. Then our third speaker, who's coming from a slightly different context, is sitting in a study somewhere near Boston today, Ivy George. So over to you, Ivy.
Thank you, Margaret. Jake, thank you very much, and thank you very much. I was struck by some of the things that you had to say. I'm sure you know that it was after the Civil War that the number of statues in the United States proliferated after the Civil War, and they were all statues of Confederate generals, just to make your point that this is about social memory and social narrative. And yeah, it's very interesting. And Margaret had asked me to speak about the Black Lives Matter movement. And she was particularly interested in why now, given there have been a whole lot of other movements. So if it's okay with you, if you can bear with me, I'll just give you a little bit of a summary statement on what's going on this side of the Atlantic with BLM. The Black Lives movement in the United States has a somewhat global focus, not global in terms of geography, but in terms of subjects. So the movement is concerned about Black people's well-being, right? And it has to do with the question of, are Black people human? And if that be the case, what does Black humanity look like? So that's sort of the primary focus of BLM movement. They're interested in basic rights and questions of dignity for African Americans. To this end, they identify police violence, poverty, and other manifestations of neglect as forms of state violence. Okay, we'll come to, I'll pick this up later, but poverty and violence as forms of institutionalized forms of state violence. And they see this as genocide of African American people. The understanding is America cannot be free if Black people are not free. It's that simple. The equation is very clear and simple. The measure of the United States' freedom is to be found in the freedom of African Americans. What is distinctive about BLM as opposed to the 1960s social movements is this is a human rights movement. This is more than a civil rights movement. It's a human rights movement, yeah? So they're not after this law or that policy. They're interested in social transformation, not merely integration. It is a very interesting time just now in the United States, and by extension, the world over, I suppose, but especially in the United States, we've had, as you know, a confluence of concerns and movements: impeach the president, go after Russia for meddling with US politics, immigration, building the wall between Mexico and the United States, legalizing gay marriage, the environment movement, on and on. And we've had several. And then, of course, now we all have global COVID pandemic. So that's, we are at the crest of all of this coming together. And there's a sense in which all of these other rumblings on the landscape have actually contributed to the energy and the intensity of the time for Black Lives Matter now. Another difference between the 60s and now is a clear understanding of intersectionality of Black life. You may know, perhaps may not, but may know that it was 3 women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. And as I got ready to come to you, I was reading a statement put out by one of the founders, and she has in no uncertain terms told every reader to tell the whole world, do not forget that the movement was inspired by 3 women, 3 queer Black women, very important. So it's from the ground up. Intersectionality is very important. It's not enough that you're Black, but you're Black and class, Black and gender, gender identity, Black and geography, Black and much else. So the intersectional aspect of human identity is very crucial for the movement. So this is where it gets global, if you know what I mean, in terms of expanding the human profile. So back again, the question is, what does it mean to be human? That is the question that BLM is putting out to the United States. What does it mean for Black people to be human at this time in this country? As opposed to being disposable, as opposed to being an animal for Derek Chauvin just 4 weeks ago when he clamped down on the life of George Floyd. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The answer very specifically to why now, scholars are talking about what they call mediated mobilization. That the movement has got the momentum and the visibility that it does because of social media and the internet. Mediated mobilization is what scholars are in part explaining for the momentum, explaining the momentum and the visibility for the movement now. So that's important to keep in mind. BLM, as you know, is on the heels of the Me Too movement, the Never Again movement. I don't know whether you're familiar. Me Too is, of course, sexual harassment, yeah? Never Again is the gun rights, gun control movement. What was the other one? Time's Up. Me Too, of course, is for sexual assault and sexual abuse. Time's Up is for sexual harassment. So there were all these movements, in any case, in the water. But of course, BLM harnesses all that energy through media and puts its case forward. The other very important difference between the movement of the 60s and now is the diversity of this movement. You have Muslims, you have atheists, you have gay people, you have old people, you have white people, you have brown people, you have all sorts of people who have been mobilized by the BLM movement now. It takes on multiple forms of violence, albeit stemming from race, economic violence, sexual violence, violence in the courts, violence by the police, environmental violence, eco-racism, clean water, clean air. All of this comes under the purview of Black rights movement people. And so in 2016, very recently, a few years ago, BLM put out a document putting out some suggestions. They first, and I'm going to give this to you, it's very brief, says there should be a shift of public resources away from policing and prisons to jobs and healthcare. So I don't know what you hear at your end in Britain, but people think, oh, defund police, do away with the police. No, it's what they call moving the money. They're moving the money from overfunding, which is the state of affairs now. We have excessively funded our police forces to healthcare, housing, community policing, so on and so forth. Secondly, a progressive tax code to ensure a sustainable redistribution of wealth. A progressive taxation system whereby poor people, the welfare of poor people are attended to through the form of taxation. Right to clean air and fresh water. Very important. What is known as eco-racism should be addressed. We can talk about this later again. I mean, the dumping of hazardous waste, congested residential environments, all of this are contributing actively to poor health. Not to mention the absence of healthcare. Yeah. Right, and then I'll conclude very quickly. Okay, so here is something that we all do well to attend to, which is, I said this much earlier, Black well-being is integrally tied up to social well-being, which means it is not possible to attend to Black issues without naturally attending to white people's concerns as well. And this is something that we need to be thinking about deep, that this is not about robbing Paul to pay Peter. So one of the problems going on in the country now, many of us are speculating that, of course, the Republicans and Trump's party are terribly anxious about this race-based movement. The liberals and the Democrats are probably quite pleased about the movement. But there will be a group of people, if they're not attended to, who will be neglected in the United States, and that is the middle and lower income white people. As it stands now today in the United States, middle and lower income white people are not able to actually articulate the crisis of globalization in their lives. So very quickly, we move to blame the other, and the other is always the one who is different from us before our eyes, and that is Black people. Yeah. And so this is why it's bizarre that Black people are against gun control. Why? Because they're afraid white people are against gun control because they fear that Blacks will get it. White people are anxious about taxation because then they think the money will have to go to Black people. White people are concerned about healthcare, free national healthcare, because they think Black. So there's this anxiety that somehow it's Black and brown that explains white crisis, when in fact, outsourcing, offshoring, globalization are some of the culprits before their eyes. But lack of education, lack of integrity on the part of political leadership to actually lay the issues out clearly, then leads to this crisis of neglect, divide, and destroy. So I'll pause there. I think, Margaret, time up, yeah?
Yeah, that's great. Yep.
Very, very sorry. Yeah. But I'm looking forward to the
conversation. Great. So that's been a kind of wonderful range of perspectives. So we've thought a little bit about the history of empire and how that's absolutely tied into the practice of slavery in a slightly new way or different way. The apartheid movement, a little bit more about Rhodes, the whole Rhodes Must Fall movement, a little bit about the role of student protest in that, and then a kind of few comments from the States, a more sociological purpose, and putting the Black Lives Matter movement into that sort of wider and sort of intersectional context. So that's lots and lots of things to be chewing over and thinking about. So we've now got a chance for questions, for comments, for observations about all sorts of aspects, as well as being free to bring in things that our speakers haven't particularly referred to. It's a huge area. And the way I suggest we do the questions is, we're probably slightly too big for me to be sure I'm going to catch you if you put your hand up. So if you could just type a Q into the question thing, you don't have to write your whole question in there, a Q or a comment if you want to say anything, that would be incredibly helpful, and we'll just sort of take you as you come. So please get typing your Qs and your Cs. The first speaker, I think, or the first question is from Saleem. Saleem, are you happy to unmute yourself and speak out your question?
Of course. So thank you to all three speakers this evening. It's been so insightful and brilliant. I've just got a quick question for Anne. So I think this week it's been announced that Oriole College is going to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and I just wondered why you think it's taken so much longer for the Rhodes Must Fall movement to come over to Oxford, but more so be successful in Oxford. Thank you.
Are we doing one at a time, Margaret? Shall I?
Probably. I'll just keep an eye on the chat. But yeah, I think
right.
if you respond to that first, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Celine. It is an excellent pressing question. The fantastic news came this week that Rhodes is going to fall in Oxford outside Oriole, for those of you who haven't heard, although they are managing to drag it out as long as they possibly can by insisting on an independent commission to approve the board's decision. I can't think exactly what an independent commission will discover about that statue that has not been unearthed in the last 4 to 5 years, but there we go. I think the reason, why is it taken so much longer at Oxford? One reason I think is basically down to money, and particularly deep alumni purses. So perhaps our analog here for Oxford, because Oriole got a lot of pushback when this was first mooted in 2015, 2016 from alumni and donors. In South Africa, a sort of similar thing happened, not at UCT around the statue of Rhodes, but there is a university in South Africa called Rhodes University, and there was a movement to change that name, and alumni came out in droves against that change because they had a very particular attachment to the place. And similarly, they had deep pockets and gave donations, and so the university pulled back on a movement to make that change. So the university in the Eastern Cape in South Africa is still currently known as Rhodes. I think Oxford wound up in a sort of similar situation. I think also what happened at UCT and what spread to other campuses in South Africa effectively shut down university operations. And so RhodesMustFall as a movement in Oxford was a big movement, but a relatively smaller movement. Even in 2015, a considerably relatively smaller movement than it has been in the last 3 weeks when it's marched alongside Black Lives Matter activists. So there was a march in Oxford before the announcement came of, I think, an estimated 4,000 people down High Street. They didn't have those numbers 4 to 5 years ago. So I think there's also something about this particular global moment that has given a tremendous amount of impetus to that movement, which is fantastic to see.
Could I just follow on from that? I don't know where I read this or if I imagined it, but just in the last couple of weeks, has an alumnus from Oriole also come out and said, actually, if you take the statue down, I will make up any loss of funding that you might, I may be imagining that. Did anyone else read that or see that anywhere? Yeah, Fred's nodding, yes.
That's fantastic. I hadn't read that. What good news.
Yeah. But, and who knows how some of the alumni who, they probably haven't had time to test them out, you know, lately, I don't know, but who knows if some of those alumni think, well, this is a different moment and may well have changed their minds. So I think there's been a real shift, hasn't there, just in the last 2 or 3 years, and certainly even in the last month.
In the last month, I think people's positions, people you would not have expected to have such shifts have. So yes, I think it's a different historical moment.
We have another statue question. I'm going to ask Jake initially to respond to it. So from Chiara, do you want to say your question, Chiara? You're somewhere here. Yes, I can see you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Churchill in particular seems to be quite a divisive figure at the moment. He's quite glorified as being a war hero, but also committed acts of atrocities and has said some very racist things. So just what are your thoughts around kind of the memorialization of such controversial figures, and like where should the line kind of be drawn?
Really good question. Jake, do you want to start and then we'll see what some of the other speakers or other people here think?
Sure, yeah, I mean, so I don't think I have a kind of personal view about Churchill and exactly where to draw the line on him versus other people. I think what I would do though is just sort of sketch out some sort of things to think about and think with. So the first is that actually with people, one of the arguments that's often made is that, you know, people are complex and you've got to see them in the time in which they were operating. And that's kind of true, but that's actually an argument against having statues full stop, because statues by definition reduce people to a kind of static version of themselves, right? And Churchill is typically depicted, you know, sort of stout overcoat, stick, you know, this is a sort of bulldog spirit of Britain. He's not depicted, you know, sitting behind a desk writing sort of terrible diatribes or sitting while, you know, kind of hearing news about sort of terrible famines that he's not addressed or that is sort of exacerbated through his political and military decisions. So I think the first thing to say is, you know, resist the urge to reduce people to a kind of balance sheet where you know, there's kind of a positive and a negative, and what's in Churchill's plus column is that he was a war leader, and in his negative column is that he, you know, committed atrocities and said some terribly racist things, and then try and kind of come up with an equation whereby you can decide, does this person still deserve a statue or not? I mean, I think that's just like a bad as a historian, but then also just as someone operating in the world, we don't necessarily want to always reduce people to kind of positives and negatives and pluses and minuses. But I think what crucially to take away from Churchill is that we should be really critical about our public art. You know, think really hard about, well, what is it to create public art? What does that do to our public space? What are the kind of choices that we make? And how do we then reflect on those choices over time? Because one of the things that's happened with Churchill has been that he's, you know, been memorialized soon after the Second World War, not just with statues, but also with the naming for places like a Cambridge College. And then in a way that just becomes a kind of naturalized aspect of his reputation. And therefore people kind of forget the other things, right? I mean, that's one of the things about naming and statues, is that they themselves are a form of erasure because they operate to emphasize certain aspects and take away from other aspects. And there's no reason to have statues of Churchill. We can have abstract statues that commemorate the Second World War. You know, that would be an alternative. We could have statues that commemorate the sacrifice of women during the Second World War. But we've chosen over several generations to make Churchill this particular figure. I suppose one of the things to think about with statues is, well, maybe there's sort of an argument against memorializing individuals so much. You know, in Britain, I suppose we have a culture of the individual achievements and success. And maybe that's not the most healthy way to create kind of public art, would be my kind of view about both Churchill and more broadly.
Thank you. I don't know if either of our other speakers have any comments to add to that, or if anyone else in the audience, as it were, has any sort of burning comments, particularly on the Churchill memorialization. Anne, Ivy, anything you want to add to that?
Well, if I can just follow up on Jake. I have been struck in the United States with the language of systemic racism. Incidentally, it's quite amusing to hear certain language gain such quick legitimacy in my country, which is white supremacy, for instance. I tell you, about 3 or 4 years ago, the language of white supremacy would be considered fascist. You know, people did not feel comfortable using that language, but now it's mainstream. One of the other terms that's mainstream just now is systemic racism. I say this because by and large, the society doesn't admit that we have a problem with systemic racism. I'm interested, Jake, in what you said about the statues, right? We now are living, all of us now are caught up in this binary mood, you know, good and bad, which is what she was trying to say, make Churchill out to be a monolithic character, which is problematic. But it's also problematic to say, oh, so something was so complex and we don't have to take responsibility for the complexity either. It's problematic. But what would be interesting really with the Churchill example is systemic racism. Where are our institutions? What kinds of schools do we have in our communities? What are they teaching the children about Churchill? Is it again a monochromatic, monolithic male hero, or are they complicating this character, right? So there's where, I mean, if we want to do racial justice, institutions have to change in terms of usual business. The other thing that I'm fascinated by, and South Africa has been my great teacher in this, is the question of reconciliation. How can we work at reconciliation in public spheres? Yeah. So the Supreme Court, what they call the Constitutional Court in South Africa, is an extraordinary piece of architecture. It's new, as in 20 years, but it is incorporated in its structure in its facade bricks from the first Johannesburg city jail where Gandhi and Mandela were booked. So there's a sense in which the people today are committed to preserving the past, redeeming the past, not erasing it. And I think that's very important, very important. So Church, it'll be fascinating to have your statues have plaques written by the victims. So don't throw Churchill out. Get the colonized people to write about him. So you keep both going together. Because Churchill means something to a whole lot of people. Don't take him away. But his impact also means a whole lot to somebody, some other group. So that, I mean, I'd be interested in those. We've got to move forward together. We have to. We can't cut people off.
So there's a couple of more comments on statues from people in the audience. Anne, I don't know if you want to sort of throw anything at you. Okay. Right, I'm going to go to Saleem and then Fred, just on the Churchill statues issue, and then we'll go back to some of the other questions that have come up. Saleem?
So I wrote my comment before Ivy had finished speaking, and my question was actually going to be, what are the other speakers' opinions on having very factual statements about all of these individuals that we've got statues of, like putting Edward Colston has enslaved this many people or was responsible for this many people's displacement. Which was interested in other people's opinions on that.
Okay, I'm going to go to Fred's question, and then if there's any other questions on statues, maybe we'll take them together, or comments. So Fred Robertson.
Yes, on statues, I think part of the problem is we have this bizarre culture where we expect them to stay there forever, and maybe we need to review statues and shift those that are no longer relevant or livable with to sort of cultural junkyards where they can sort of stand around and be relatively inoffensive. I was wanting really to raise, though, the specific question of, which has just been mentioned actually, of interpretation boards and things like that. There are those who say, for instance, that the statue of Londonderry in the marketplace in Durham, who was a pretty vicious coal owner, should stay and have an interpretation board. But I wonder if an interpretation board actually leads us into the difficulty which Jake mentioned of having balance sheets. So you have, you know, this person did this, but they also did that, and so on and so on. And I just wonder sort of where that leads you, rather than melting the thing down or hoying it in the river.
Okay, and before you answer that, so I'm going to take one more kind of statues question from Kavya, and then I'm going to go back to some of the others from earlier people. So Kavya, what's your question about statues?
First of all, thank you to all the speakers who've given their time to us to explain everything. It's been great to hear your perspectives on everything. But my question is posed to Mr. Richards, who has made a point about abstract statues depicting world wars instead of specifically making them with respect to glorified war leaders. But I feel that it still doesn't represent the holistic violence imposed on the colonies, because a lot of the cavalry, weaponry, soldiers came from the colonies colonized by the empire. Even though they had absolutely no vested interest, there was no choice in fighting these wars. So even abstract statues depicting those wars would not completely do justice, because it doesn't depict the bloodshed and loss of lives of people who had absolutely no choice in participating in these wars.
Jake, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I can say things about all three.
Great, please.
So Saleem's point about plaques. Yeah, I mean, so I think maybe one of the big things to take away from this is that, yes, we should start seeing statues as kind of living parts of our public life, rather than as naturalized things that sit in a landscape and aren't ever subject to change or critique or renewal, or, you know, a kind of socially contracted process of discussion. So plaques could work. I mean, it is worth mentioning that that is the solution that was posed in Bristol. And in Bristol, you know, there had been a sort of 30-year campaign by Black Bristolians to say, well, you know, we don't respect this statue, we don't honour it, we think it's really problematic for what it says about about Bristol and about our place in Bristol. And they did that kind of constitutionally, you know, lobbying the local council, getting petitions in, getting planning permission in. And eventually a plaque was proposed and supported by the council as a solution. But there was then a disagreement in the council over the wording that that plaque should have on it about Colston's role in the slave trade. So I think one thing to take away from this is the solutions aren't necessarily easy. And, you know, I would say that I'm generally against criminal actions that could that remove public art, not because I like Colston, but because I think it sort of jeopardizes the people that do that work, that they might then be subject to criminal prosecutions that aren't, you know, you know, I wouldn't want to see that happen. But you know, in this case, it's also hard to see what other solution there was going to be. And it is worth pointing out that the press, even sort of centrist and centre-right press, like the Financial Times and the Times and the Economist, within a week had all published editorials saying things like, well, yes, of course Colston was terrible and the slave trade was terrible, so he was an obvious case to remove, but now we surely mustn't remove Churchill. And, you know, for the previous 30 years, these papers had never said anything about Colston, or when this issue had ever come up, they'd always said, no, we cannot taint the past, we cannot reshape the past. So you've got to also remember that public discourse changes very quickly, and that what was once a radical position all of a sudden looks like the status quo after the event. So, you know, the plaque, which in 2015 would have been the kind of radical solution, now looks totally outdated. But yeah, in some cases that might be the right way to go. And I guess this comes to Fred's point about interpretation boards. I'm open-minded. I mean, Albie Sachs had proposed a similar thing over Rhodes. I think actually making public statues a new form of response art, a new form of public art, where new voices get commissioned to do artwork that is placed alongside or against, or in some way, could be really positive. And, you know, that I'm open to that being a solution in some cases. I don't think there needs to be a uniform model. I do think what you say effectively about sunset clauses is important, though. I think actually it would be good if all of these 800 public statues in Britain do in effect have a sunset clause, where after X number of years, we then, you know, everyone is kind of invited into a debate of like, well, do we still think we should honour this person? You know, what is our honour culture supposed to represent? And this comes to Kavya, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. This comes to Kavya's point about abstract art as well. You're absolutely right about how colonised subjects served in the British Army. You know, that's a history that has at least 200 years before the Second World War of both enslaved and freed people serving in the military in campaigns to either colonise new areas. In the American Revolution, the British conscripted slaves with the promise of freedom to fight against the revolutionaries, and then resettled them elsewhere in the British Empire. So there's absolutely that long history of Britain mobilising colonised peoples, enslaved peoples to serve their military expansionist interests. And that is totally kind of forgotten in public life in Britain. And I guess I wasn't saying that abstract art would kind of get us to an easy solution, or that abstract art would be somehow a kind of pure form of art. I guess my point is just that we don't need to have an honour culture that honours individuals above others. And that the effect of that has been in Britain that essentially, because so many statues went up in the 19th century, it's overwhelmingly white men who are, you know, wealthy, you know, military men involved in the empire, connected to slavery. And that's not necessarily the collective choice we want to make going forward. And we can reshape and transform our honour culture in all sorts of ways. Plenty of cultures don't honour individuals, don't honour military battles. There's no need to do that. So my kind of the point I would make is, you know, you can critique, by critiquing statues, you also kind of critique a wider culture.
Thank you very much. So I think that's a good sort of innings for statues and the legacy of public art. So I'm going to move on to Olivian now, who has a question.
So thank you very much for all of your statements. So of course, got a question for Ivy. So you mentioned that, well, with the BLM movement right now, Democrats, liberals, they're all reveling in the momentum that's built up. And the way that the whole debate, I guess, is framed around politics. So the anti-protesters in London right now, protesting to like save the statues, they're framed as alt-right. So, but is this really an issue of politics? Because the way I see it is this is an issue of human rights. But as with everything, this has been framed around politics, and like just like to like have your opinion on that, I guess.
Yeah, well, Olivia, it's much easier to reduce things to politics than to actually take on bigger questions, isn't it? Of how do we understand a nation state? Who comprises the nation? How do we understand freedom? Is it for all? Is white supremacy a thing? Is patriarchy for real? I mean, those are hard questions. So it's so much easier to reduce it and isolate it to something political, Republican and Democrats, you know, fake news and this and that, and domesticate these very difficult questions. But there's a sense in which there's so much at stake now. There's so much at stake. Our very, you know, confidence in politics, in economics, in culture is all being shaken up. I mean, it's extraordinary what the BLM has done in the last few weeks. Yeah, not just one group of people, all people. Nobody's been spared in asking very difficult questions and just watching their shadow. Where have I come from? Really? Is it me? Could it be? So, yeah.
Thank you. Again, quite a lot of questions on the piling up in the chat. So Gia, I'm going to come to you next. Where are you in the? Are you still with us? Gia, are you here with your question? No?
Oh,
yep.
Hi, sorry.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
A while to figure that one out. Yeah, I just a question for Jake. Could you clarify your point on slavery within Africa? So you were saying that it's all to do with violence, but does that really justify the slavery in Africa? And people are using it to justify the other. So what are your thoughts on that, just a bit more deeply?
Thank you. So I wasn't quite clear what you meant about justify the other, but you can come, if I don't answer your question, then let me know and I can come back and say more. So in terms of slavery in Africa, my point was that I think one of the things that comes out in debates around Atlantic slavery as a way to kind of absolve Britain of a role, or the US as a role, is to say, well, these were people that were already slaves in Africa, and that Africans practiced slavery on other Africans. And it was therefore a kind of natural legalistic system that was permitted within Africa and recognized elsewhere in the Atlantic world. So essentially all that the Europeans were doing, and the white people were doing, was essentially buying commodities that were legitimately recognized as a kind of fair deal, and then transporting them elsewhere. And the point I was trying to make is that slavery was never kind of like a natural state of being in Africa. The people that were subject to enslavement didn't see what happened to them as legitimate or fair or kind of legal or natural or just the order of things. That they were people that were subject to processes, and those were processes of power. So warfare being a particular one, so warfare from an outside group that attacked their group, their society, and captured them in that process. And that those people, or you know, for as I said, for punishment for a given crime, and the fact that actually in a lot of cases the definitions of what counted as crime were expanded to subject ever greater numbers of the poorest, the most vulnerable people to enslavement and sell them to Europeans. And there's also the point that Europeans were complicit in that expansion of enslavement in Africa, because there were Europeans sold, for example, guns on the West African coast to powerful people who could then go further inland and use those guns to wage ever greater wars, to capture more people, to sell them to the Europeans, to buy more guns, to wage ever greater wars. So the point being that, that enslavement wasn't natural, and that it was both violent within Africa, and that the Europeans knowingly exploited that violence to gain ever greater numbers of captives on the coast to then transport them overseas. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, it does. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Next up, I'm going to ask Robbie. I think you have a question. Robbie Bell.
Hi, yeah, thank you for everything. I don't know who this is best suited as a question to, but Anne, you were talking about how it's sort of not surprising these things started as student activism. But I know at least my personal experience at Durham as a whole is it feels quite, even amongst the students, quite politically apathetic compared to what I'd expected coming to uni for that reason. I don't know if that's like a universal experience, but I don't know if it's tied to do with the fact that Durham is so undiverse, so sort of white and middle class, compared to maybe a more normal uni. But I guess that might not actually be the case. But if that is the case, how can we shift the culture in Durham, I suppose in particular in Chads, to become less passive and more, like, one of the phrases I guess at the moment is like anti-racist, and actually challenging stuff actively rather than just not doing it yourself? Yeah.
Wow, so any wisdom? So Anne, do you want to kick off on this one?
I mean, that's the question, right? That's the best question, I think. I think I would say, so what you say about the kind of feeling of potentially not a political, maybe a political apathy, certainly an apathy around the experience of students who don't conform to the sort of stereotypical Durham model, resonates with me. I came to Durham 2 years ago from a university in South Africa, and it was quite a big culture shock. But I would say that I actually think that sort of feeling of apathy is probably not so dissimilar from other universities before moments of kind of political rupture and protest organization. If you were to talk to students on the campus of UCT and on my campus at WITS in 2012, 2013, you would have had a number of sort of highly politically conscious students who felt really, deeply constrained by the spaces in which they were living and learning. And that is what prompted this sort of movement. And as a historian, I think when I look back at student movements, there are all sorts of contingencies that I see kind of leading up to them. I think we are in one of those moments now. And so if it's at all possible, trying to seize on the energy that comes from a global movement, a global moment like this, and channel it into organization where possible, because more people probably feel constrained by that apathy than you think. And equally, people who hadn't felt constrained by it before are hopefully becoming conscientized to it and aware of why it's problematic. That we're having this discussion now, I think, is a sort of opening up of that space. And then the next step is talking to your friends about it, saying, what are we going to do? The fact that we have to do it all on Zoom is a little bit difficult. Like, it would be great if we could be in Durham and have a march and kind of gather at a safe distance on Palace Green. But when we're allowed to do that, when we're back here, I think those kind of physical manifestations are important, because people see it and they recognize, oh wait, there's something going on here that I can be a part of as well. I don't know if that's wisdom. Maybe the others have better ideas.
I just wonder if I could push the question back to some of you in the audience, so particularly the Chad students. So my question for you is this just a fleeting moment, or is something deeply changed? So I'm sure some of you have been really committed and passionate about some of these issues for a long time. Some of you are probably, you know, thinking, wow, this is really important, and reflecting in ways that you haven't before. But I'm curious to know what you think, you know, is this going to lead to real change, real transformation, or not? So I don't know if you want to start, Robbie, if there's any other people who want to kind of, I'm aware there's a few others in the chat that I'm going to come back to your questions in a wee bit, but any thoughts, comments from you guys?
Hi, sorry if I can jump in.
Yep.
I don't think that a lot of Durham students do genuinely want to change. It is a real sad issue, but just even thinking about like the amount of people that we've had, sociology did a very similar Zoom call, and you'd think that sociology being like, has the impression of being one of like the most woke or the most politically active, and it was not a big Zoom call. I think people want to share a black screen on social media, or they want to post something, be like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter, but they'll still make like, I've heard like some awful things, like say something like, oh, that student's only here because they are of a certain ethnicity, or say something like that. Anything that's perfectly acceptable at the same time. So I think a lot of Durham students, as much as it does pain me to say it, are just in it for the social media clout, or just wanting to be seen as woke, but not actually wanting to make proper changes to themselves. So it's my depressing take.
Yeah. Anna, I see you're agreeing with that. And Liberty, you've got a comment? So just be interested to hear what people think about that. Liberty, do you want to?
Yeah, I think so based on what Anna was saying, I think that when we're looking at movements like this and people trying to enact change, you've got to think about like who benefits from things being as they currently are. So I think obviously the way that the system's set up now is like most beneficial to like as Robbie said, many like Durham students are white middle class. So if there's nothing in your life like affecting you day to day, you're not gonna see it, and then like as a result of that you will have less impetus to kind of try and enact change. And I think, you know, recently we've seen things in Durham like the Purple Radio like podcast that the first year student, I think her name's Mirabelle, did on experiences of like students of colour at Durham. And I think for students, like for black students at Durham, or, you know, for students from other minorities, like every day they're confronted with like that reality, whereas I think for like a white middle class student, like they might just kind of every day they're not faced with things that like cause them to really have that like sense of action. So I think we need to like find ways of actually making the whole dialogue inclusive and show why like we as a community are stronger if we come together, and how this benefits everyone. It's not just like somebody else's concern or something that won't impact me. It like has to be something that we all like benefit from and work on together, and realize that that's like a change that we need to see.
Thank you, Liberty. Leah, you've got a comment.
Hey, yeah, I think I'm slightly a bit more optimistic about the Black Lives Matter movement and like the way people are approaching and discussing racism, because I think for the longest time, like discussions and discourse around racism have been largely happening in like black and like spaces of color essentially, and now we can kind of see that white people are definitely engaging with the subject and the issue, and are actually having the conversation without needing a mediator or an arbitrator, or if that makes sense. Like the conversations are happening on their own and of their own accord. Like this is kind of the biggest example of that, the fact that like we are in like quite a very white conservative space, but we've managed to kind of somehow, like we've all managed to coalesce like around our like shared interests. I also think that like the fact that like the Black Lives Matter movement right now, like from like where I am in terms of like the space I'm in and organizing and stuff, I think a good thing about it is it's been like presented in explicitly like anti-capitalist terms. So a lot of the discussion has been centered around like the way that capitalism has just essentially like enabled, like going back from like slavery and stuff, has kind of enabled the exploitation of specific people groups. And so I think in that sense that I'm like definitely quite optimistic. But I feel like it's just like, I think an issue is just like the like issue that we all talked about, like with regards to like the performativity of like politics and whether or not people want to like continue and like keep the momentum going and put in the like real resource, like put in the real labor that is required of like active anti-racist campaigning.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that following Leah? You know, will this lead to real change in Chads, anywhere else?
Can I just suggest?
Yep, sure.
I mean, if there are other students who want to come in, they should definitely get priority. But I mean, just one sort of point to make would be that there are kind of practical things that you can do that are insertion points that can lead to bigger change within an institution. So to give you an example, I heard kind of prominent historian say that when she had her first job at Emory University, which is in Atlanta in Georgia. So you know, Atlanta has a large African American population. Emory is a very prestigious university, and this was in the 1980s. She was there with a couple of African American historians. They were hired at the same time. And Emory's history PhD program had never had an African American person in that program in the 80s. And these two African Americans that were hired alongside this person left after 1 year because they found it intolerable, a terrible environment to work in. But one of them had taken this person to one side and said, look, it's on you to change things in Emory. And here are all the applications of people that came to do a PhD here. And you'll see that the African American applicants were never followed up on. You know, they never got a call back. They never had anyone write back to them. So they just, you know, they gave up or they went elsewhere. And this person said, okay, fine, I'll you know, next year I will follow up. I'll write back to every African American applicant we get. And 5 years later, Emory was graduating a significant portion of African American PhD students across the whole of the US, just because this one member of staff, who was a white member of staff, by the way, had bothered to kind of follow up on these letters 5 years ago. So that's kind of an insertion point. And I think the reason why I mention this is because there are insertion points in Durham. So for example, I think it's important that students do things like ask your college and your department to be transparent about who's applying to courses. You know, what are the ratios in terms of race and in terms of disadvantage of the students who are applying? And are they working? Is your department really working hard enough to change those, you know, those ratios in favor of disadvantaged students? What is your department doing to recruit Black students for PhDs? What are they doing in terms of, you know, releasing data in terms of how many Black applicants to jobs are they interviewing? Are they shortlisting? Are they appointing? These are all things that you can do, you know, through email. And there should be white people that are willing to do that labor with you. You know, don't let this become a burden on Black and other minority students. I think the second thing to say is recruit scientists into this as well. Don't let this activism be the thing which all of us that are doing groovy intersectionality are kind of doing all the labor for, right? Scientists have a problem, like I mentioned, about race science, but it's kind of a thing which they disavow. So, you know, tell your friends who are undergraduates in biology or in chemistry, well, you're implicated. If you don't want to change the system, you're implicated too, and your discipline is implicated too. So they're just a couple of things that I think actually, as students, you can do to kind of shift the public discourse along in Durham.
Great, thank you very much. Right, I'm aware we're behind with questions. I just want to tell you what I'm planning. Okay, it is coming up to 7:30, but I personally think this conversation is too good to end at the moment. Some people may need to go, but I'm going to carry on enabling it for a while to go, partly because I want to get through some of these very, very good questions, if that's okay with everyone. So I'm going to go back a while now to Anna. I think had a question a while back. Anna, did you ask your question? Is that still relevant? Are you still with us? Yeah.
I think it's a slightly different topic.
Okay, thank you.
It's kind of directed at Ivy, but obviously everyone can talk on it. But she mentioned kind of briefly that there is an issue on like a lot of working class people and low income people have a lot of fears on globalization, and how do we have a good conversation about that without either platforming racists or just sweeping up their issues as being unimportant? And then maybe a separate issue would be that racism is often kind of painted as a working class issue, kind of an uneducated people's issue, but actually in my experiences from what I've heard people say, it's kind of been quite the opposite. And we've seen from things like Boris Johnson's comments that the people in power have got serious issues that we need to address. And it's not just a working class issue, although there certainly is racism within working classes. So my point is, how do we talk about racism without making sure that everyone's voices are heard?
Yeah. I think it goes back to what Jake just said in terms of what is going on in our institutions, what is going on in school, what is going on in college, what's the nature of your curriculum, are all the classes getting the same opportunity to unpack the same problem? How do we understand race? How do we understand globalization? I can't speak to your institutions, but our school children are not terribly well educated. I have a student who's just finishing up her medical degree in the next month in South Africa. And she said in 1994, she was in school in Durban. She was in the 8th standard or 9th, and the history teacher came in the morning and had a brown paper bag, and she went up and down the rows, taking every history textbook off the desk and putting it in the brown bag. Now, it's a very dramatic demonstration. But the point is, what is the history we are feeding our children? What stories do we tell them? What are the truths we deliver? Because democracy depends on being informed. And if there are system failures at that end, who do we recruit? What is our curriculum? Who is our neighbor? When it's easy for liberals to talk about systemic racism is out there, but I've got to be able to explain how I got my job. I want to be able to tell my child why it is that she goes to this school and not the other school. Why am I living on this street and not the other street? Why is it that my friends, I don't have any African-American friends? This is extraordinary. And then we want to rectify race relations. Something's not right. Yeah. And this is what, as I said, going back to Jake, the onus is on us to stop business as usual. Otherwise, as James Baldwin beautifully said, the fire next time is around the corner.
Thank you. Sorry, I hope I'm not getting too behind with the questions, but I've just put in the chat the next orders. So Samishka, then Brian, then Fred. And please tell me if I've missed you, because the chat's now quite hard to follow. It's so long. So over to you, Samishka.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's keeping well and safe during this pandemic. So yeah, I have a question about reparations. I hope it's not too off topic, but in relation to slavery, there's been much debate about reparations, whether they should be done through financial means, and if that's the best way in looking at amending past atrocities in slavery. So my question is, what are the speakers' thoughts about monetary reparations? Should they be quantified to help the livelihood of victims affected? Or would monetary repayments take away from the actual understanding and prevention of systemic racism as a result of slavery? And would it just reduce societal progression and being anti-racist in general to just monetary transactions?
Right, really good question. Which of our speakers would like to start off responding? Anne, Jake? Do you want to go first?
I don't mind.
Okay, Jake, go ahead. Yep.
I think Jake's probably more qualified, so he can go first.
Okay.
Okay, all right. I mean, I think Well, so I suppose the first thing to say is I think reparations debates are a good example of where morality and law don't fit together. So I think a lot of people can kind of make a sort of moral argument which says that you know, the past harm which clearly has an effect up to the present day, something that deserves a kind of compensatory mechanism to correct it, and that will tend to involve money. It could involve other kinds of correction too, I guess. I mean, but sort of legally, I think reparations arguments are on like very difficult ground in North America and in Britain. I'm not saying there shouldn't be the fight, but I'm just observing that actually it's very difficult to say, you know, if there's not a living, identifiable, culpable agent, if there is not a sort of identifiable harm that was understood legally at the time as an identifiable harm, and then if there's not an identifiable victim, it's actually very hard to kind of make a reparations argument that would stack up. And I doubt that we're going to see a flourishing of businesses or people that have inherited wealth from something like slavery voluntarily giving that money. So, you know, if there's going to have to be a kind of conflict process, like a legal process to make that happen, I doubt reparationists will win that argument, be my kind of view. I mean, I think what I would say is that I think money should feature within any kind of framework, but I would much rather actually the debate was about reparative justice and what holistic justice looks like across a whole range of things. And that might well have to be ultimately kind of financed. But I do think it is important that it does stretch, as I think you said in your question, that it doesn't sort of reduce all social transactions to a monetary scale. I mean, I think it's also important that we have, when it comes to this kind of reparations or reparative justice framework, that it's important to think that, you know, that you don't kind of foreclose when the work is done. Because I suppose one of the issues about reparations is, well, if you pay the compensation money and it's enough, does that mean that the work is done? And I don't think it necessarily does. I think actually really what you need to see from institutions is a long horizon commitment to justice. Is saying things like, well, look, we recognize that this is a problem that has developed, as I say, sort of systemically over, you know, centuries. And actually our commitment to this on the basis of Durham will be here in centuries' time, as will many leading UK and US businesses and universities and institutions. You know, our commitment to this has to also be open-ended and long-ranging. And I mean, I can talk more kind of concretely about some kind of initiatives that I think would help, but I mean, like in Durham, for example, there are conversations over our links, over the institution's links to Codrington College in the Caribbean and to Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone, and what that means over Black education, over kind of development agenda in these places. And I think it's important that if a kind of a reparative framework starts operating in Durham, that we don't just let that sort of sit at, well, you know, if there's one sort of visiting scholarship every year from Barbados to Durham or from Sierra Leone to Durham, that's enough. Or, you know, if we make sure that we have a couple of PhD students, that's enough. I think we need to, you know, involve people in those places as primary agents in the process of talking about what they would want, what you know, what they would see as being important in a kind of reparative framework, and seeing it as an open-ended commitment as well.
Sorry. I'm happy to move on unless either Anne or Ivy have anything to add, because I'm aware of a few more questions. Yeah.
Margaret, Jake, is it possible really to take all of this into consideration without an examination of whiteness?
To say a bit more, Ivy?
The power of it. I'm talking about institutional, cultural, the power of whiteness. What do you mean by whites? I mean, I'm not asking you this, but what does anyone mean by white supremacy? That has to be unpacked. We can't just leave it on families to fix it. We can't leave it on institutions. We can't just leave it on governments. It's got to be a collaborative, it's that truth and reconciliation idea, you know. what are the truths that we haven't confessed to? If that is the case, do we have a responsibility? I mean, one of the things in the United States now, some months ago, I was introduced to this descendants of American slaves, yeah, DAS. It's a very strict classification because, as you know, affirmative action policy, 1968, yeah, it was actually it was a policy designated to address groups of people who have been historically discriminated against. But the people who benefited most from affirmative action policy from then to today are white women. It's a bit of a joke, because what happens is this supposedly well-meaning policy has been restored back into white meritocracy. So that's what I mean. You know, it's just very hard, really.
I think we're going to come back to this topic in a couple of questions' time, but someone who's been waiting really patiently and who's been slightly challenged with his internet is Brian. So Brian, if you're back with us, are you happy to ask your question now? So I think, is Brian here? Brian, are you happy to ask your question if you unmute yourself? Great, thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you.
So Brian's having a few problems with his internet, so he's been going in and out a little bit. So Brian, you're muted now, if you want to unmute and then share your question. Can you unmute yourself? I'll tell you what, I think Brian, we can't hear Brian at the moment. His question, if I can articulate your question from the chat.
Oh, okay, yes, thank you very much.
We hear you. Okay,
my
question. Sorry, we can't hear you again, Brian. That's really frustrating. But your question that you posed was in connection with Jake's statement. Whose responsibility does it become to see change, the perpetrators or the victims?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead. Can't hear you again.
It's fine. I can see the question.
Okay, great. So Jake, do you want to take away? Respond to Brian's question.
I suppose the first thing to say is like Ivy said, I think it's everyone's responsibility. You know, one of the important things about this moment is that we see this as everyone's collective responsibility, and that we don't just divide this into perpetrators and victims, but that, you know, there are other classes of people involved here too. There are bystanders, for example, and they're implicated too. So I would say that, you know, it's on all of us to make the changes and to fight for these changes. And I suppose I think it is important that, again, as Ivy said, that in a way that sort of resolving some of these issues over the quality of Black life in the US has to be also seen as improving social life as a whole. I mean, that's sort of been a consistent argument that abolitionists made in the 19th century, that actually slavery corrupted white people. It wasn't just Black life that was somehow you know, dishonored and disordered by slavery, that actually it introduced all sorts of pathologies into white people. And I think that's the same thing that has to happen now. I mean, to put it in sort of very sort of blunt, concrete terms in the US, you know, African-American, the median African-American household has 1/10 of the wealth of the median white household. There are plenty of African-American households that are in negative equity because of the financial crisis. And actually that, you know, we know that poverty has, you know, really negative effects on people's physical health, their mental health. And therefore, you know, in terms of the overall burden on health services, there would be an argument for saying actually unconditional cash transfers to the poorest people would probably improve health outcomes across the board and health spending across the board too. You know, there are similar wealth inequalities in the UK between Black African households and white households. So, you know, this is by no means a US only problem. But I suppose what I would say is, yeah, overall, it is important that we see this moment as something that is different from the civil rights moment, because it is a time where we should all feel that we are implicated and responsible for the change.
Sorry, any comments from Anne or Ivy?
On Brian's question about
Yes.
perpetrators and victims, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it's something that requires the participation of everyone, and that's where South Africa is maybe a little bit of a model because of the TRC, which Ivy's mentioned, but also potentially a cautionary tale about the degree to which everyone opted into that process and has actively continued to engage with it. That this is the kind, the structures we're dealing with are so deep. If we use that term, systemic racism, they pervade our social systems, that undoing them is not the work of kind of one conversation or one protest movement. It's an ongoing thing, and it's something that has to bring in basically everybody who's involved in society, because we are all participating in these systems. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on, the next person who's got a question, I think, is Fred Robinson. So if you want, are you happy to unmute yourself, Fred?
Yeah, unmute myself.
You're unmuted, actually, we can hear you.
Unmuted,
yeah.
I think, yes. Yes, a bit of a slight ramble, if you'll allow me, Margaret. I was thinking actually about the importance of education. Education is what we're supposed to be about as a university and a college. And it seems absolutely central to educate ourselves in our own history, for one thing, and our current situation for another. So I think looking ahead, I would suggest that a way forward with all this, from our point of view as a college, is to look more deeply at where we are and also where we've been. And I merely put the suggestion about thinking about whether we really want the continued association with the Horsefalls. That's a very specific thing, because that's part of our history, and it could be considered a difficult part of our history. Our first benefactor, whose grandparents were slave owners and were compensated, as you know, when the trade was abolished. They were from Liverpool. So it's that kind of thing I think we need to bring out into the open and just deal with.
Thank you, Fred. So any comments about that or questions about that? About our own heritage, where our own founding money comes from?
I mean, I for one didn't know about the Horsefall thing, which is quite interesting. Thanks for that, Fred. That's yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
So Horsefall is one of our two founders, and his grandfather was a slave owner. So we don't know for sure, but we can presumably deduce that some of his wealth, I mean, he got wealth from, I'm sure, other sources as well, but we probably should assume that some of his wealth came from that. Yeah, so good point, Fred, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to Jaya. You had a question?
Hi, yeah. So my question was that we talk a lot about white people in contrast with Black and ethnic minority people, and we bunch them all together. But what about the racism within those minorities? I know that there are caste systems in a lot of ethnic minorities that are maybe not looked at, and Black experiences are often very different from people of other ethnic minorities, but it seems to me that we just lump them all together. So what are the speakers' opinions on that?
So I'm getting too good at muting myself. Ivy, can I start with you? Can you respond first to that question?
Yeah, well, Jaya, is it? She's here, yeah.
Yeah, Jia.
Right. you know, that conversation is going on here in the United States now. Different groups have been forming and talking, for instance, Indians for the Black Lives Movement, which is fine. But I think going back to earlier conversations this afternoon about education, it would be helpful really to place slavery on this continuum of recent history. Slavery fueled modern capitalism. Slavery provided a basis for even nation states to build, right? Now the caste system in India, there are any number of scholars now who will sort of associate it directly with British colonialism. Now, I find that hugely problematic because it's an ancient system of stratification that cannot be simply explained away with colonialism. It's sort of like African slavery. The weakness in the system was an opportunity to exploit by the colonizer. But the system's been in place as well. More interesting really I speak as an Indian now, is to ask how it is that the Indians are in the West. How do they end up in the West? You can't answer that question without answering white supremacy and colonialism. And they're loath to go there because of their own upper caste standing. And you see, the thing about race uniquely is that it's such a humiliating fact. It demolishes people's humanity. I mean, I just think we need to spend a whole lot of time dwelling on what racing somebody does. It just knocks your humanity, right? So most immigrants in the UK and in the United States, and I'm talking about the last 50 years, dread being raced. Instead, they want to be seen as individuals. And of course, in recent history, people of African origins, and I speak in the United States, and perhaps in this country too, in your country, today is Windrush Day, isn't it? That's what I heard. Did you know that? Did you know that in Britain, today's Windrush Day? Yeah, it's a very important day, really. I mean, it's a big move to acknowledge. But the point is, most non-Black, non-white immigrants work very hard, very quickly to disassociate themselves from people of African origin because of the pedigree of slavery. But if they were historically in tune, they would see that they too are just a few degrees off from that continuum in history, because they would have to explain their own displacement, as I say, a boomerang of imperialism. They have to explain how they had lost their own culture, albeit voluntarily even, to get closer and closer to white supremacy. So it's from that perspective then, it's important that we all become friends. That we say, I'm just a few years ahead or a few years behind, but we're all in this together. And of course, white supremacy enjoys divide and destruction. You know, in the United States, they talk about East Asians as the model minority. Model for whom? I mean, that's explicitly racist, right? But of course, what happens is when you're groveling for the crumbs at the table, you're just so happy, you walk away with it. Yes, I'm the model minority, I'm not Black. And there we are. Sorry, I didn't mean to ramble, but I don't know, Jaya, if I sort of addressed anything that you asked about.
No, I think you've covered some of the points, yeah, thank you.
Either of other speakers just want to come in on that? No pressure to, but if there's something you'd like to add, please feel free.
I would say that I think that's I mean, there are real distinct and historically rooted fissures, and Ivy's so eloquently pulled out why people are incited to kind of continue to participate in them and to buy into them. But there are political choices that we can make to try to overcome them. If we look at the South African example, and I know I keep harping on the South African example, but that's why I'm here. The Black consciousness ideology emerges explicitly to try to do this, to bring together Black South Africans, Indian South Africans, and colored South Africans together within a political project that's oriented around their shared racial oppression. And so I think where we can find resonances across people's experiences that can hopefully bridge those differences is where you can really build bridges and you can make movements happen.
Just to add to that, as a South Asian myself, I've noticed, and from the history that I've studied, anti-Blackness has set in after colonialism. So racism within minorities itself is a hangover of white supremacy, because individual cultures want to mold themselves into a model minority that white people accept. So then again, it stems back to the whole question of how do we tackle white supremacy to kind of identify our own culture, or do we do it the other way around? Do we identify our own culture and then tackle white supremacy? I just wanted to know your opinion on that.
No, but I think it's both, right? It's not either or. We've got to work on all of these things as the opportunities present themselves. You know, I was talking with. I came to the United States in 1977, and yesterday I was talking with my very first friend I made. She's a Black woman, and for the first time in the conversation yesterday, I said, "Why did I become your friend?" I asked myself, because most Indians in the 1970s, pretty much even now, but far less so, they stayed away from Black America because Black Americans retard anybody's mobility. So you don't want to be associated. I'm just telling it to you like it is. I'm not sugarcoating anything. It's the fact, right? So here I was. It was a strange thing. I became friends with 3 Black women. And it was only yesterday I realized it was in part, I think it was possible because I was fleeing. I left India because I just could not bear the stratification, the misogyny, and the colorism. And so presumably I was fleeing it. And then suddenly I had the opportunity to erase it all. And there it was. But there's no guarantee, there's no telling, there's mystery to how it is we seek advantage and privilege and betterment and superiority. And I think in great part it has to do with this incredibly competitive system of merit and success we put forward in modernity for the last 200, 300 years, where human value is in the individual, competitive, and isolated person, not somebody who's a member of the species, you know. So, I don't know if I've helped, yeah, but it's got to be both. You've got to be white supremacy and caste supremacy, whatever the baggage you're carrying, we've got to deal with it all.
Thank you, Ivy. I'm going to take one more question from Gregoire, and then I'm going to say a few wrapping up comments. And so we may go a tiny bit over 8, so I'm probably sorry for breaking my promise, but Gregoire, your question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the conversation. Can you hear me? Okay. So I have a question that's maybe a bit less academic, I don't know. But it's about, so we all acknowledge that we need to increase the percentages of the number of Black people inside the university, because we know it's quite a white male or white middle class university, as we say in Durham. And I'm from computer science, and computer science, we've got a similar problem with gender imbalance, and we're trying to address that problem. But the idea is that there's a vicious circle there, that because there's few women in computer science, not many women want to attend computer science. And that kind of perpetuates the cycle that we're trying to bring back and to break, and essentially try to get 50-50. So no balance at all. But of course, when we talk about, I think, minorities, it's not, we're never going, I mean, I won't say never, but it's unlikely that we'll have like 50% Black inside the university. So there will be like always some kind of minority, even though we can adjust the numbers and improve things. And we always see, as a university every year, we read comments like in the Palatinate, for instance, about students who feel very isolated, who are coming from minorities inside Durham. And it's not just about racism. I think it's just about the fact sometimes people come from a background where they had people who are similar to them. They come to Durham and then suddenly it's a very different, so there's a strong culture shock. And it's also about microaggressions. So it's not just about them, but about us as well. Other people who might not realize by their questions or the way they behave that there's some kind of aggression there. I'm wondering how we can address those issues and maybe make Durham like a better place for those individuals.
That's a really good question. I don't know if any speakers want to say a brief word, and then I'll sum up. Anne?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great and really important question, Gregor, because you're right. Durham is a very alienating space for some of our students, and it's on all of us who exist in this space to try to disrupt that alienation and to make it a more welcoming space. And so if I'm somebody who doesn't feel alienated by the space of Durham, the first step is just to realize that that experience is not homogenous for everybody, and to recognize that my friends who don't look exactly like me are experiencing this place differently, to listen to their experiences and to be willing to act when they ask you to. I think that's extremely important. Also, you mentioned microaggressions. We all commit them sometimes unintentionally. So be able to hear it when somebody tells you, hey, that was a microaggression, or even just think, am I potentially, even if I'm unintentionally doing it, am I being aggressive in a micro way or potentially a macro way, hopefully not, to this person? Just be cognizant about the difference in the space and how this space affects people differently, I think is extremely important.
Thank you. Any of our other speakers just want a final word on that? Again, no pressure, but is there anything you'd like to say?
I mean, I think one thing to say about the kind of environment that's created is that, you know, people don't necessarily want to hear that they're racist or they have prejudices, and it can also be quite difficult to point them out to people. And I think sometimes there can be just some helpful things that you can do which aren't confrontational, that get to the roots of them. So I think one thing is to think about the kind of language that people use, and if they use terms that you're not comfortable with, or that you think are kind of, or they've said some kind of generalization about a group of people and you think, well, you know, that doesn't sit with me right. I think just being someone who can say, oh, why do you say that? Or what do you mean by that? Can often be a very effective first step, especially if you're meeting people that you don't know really well, because it doesn't come across as hostile or aggressive, but it immediately gives that person a kind of invitation to reconsider what could often be a just kind of received opinion. They're spouting off something that they maybe heard, you know, their parents say, or you know, that they saw on TV or something. And I think just those kind of phrases that kind of encourage someone to reflect on themselves and what they've just said are quite helpful, because quite often then those kind of opinions can break down without you needing to sort of say, and so you should never say that kind of thing again. I mean, there are lots of anti-racist kind of pedagogy type techniques out there, and you can look them up and try and introduce them amongst the students. I mean, things like stand where you stand, I've heard very good things about, you know, where you give people, a group of people, an opinion or a phrase or a statement, and you ask them to stand on a continuum of strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then, you know, everyone kind of stands where they want to, and there's no judgment. And then you ask people, okay, so why did you stand there? Or why did you stand there? And then through that conversation, you then ask people, okay, now, having heard our conversation, where would you now stand? And you can see how people's opinions shift through that conversation. So I think kind of believing that people do want to change when confronted with prejudices is an important part of this. And finding those kind of insertion points and practical techniques of doing so is really important.
Thank you very much, Jake. I'm actually going to wrap this up just in a couple of minutes because it is after 8. And I think the thing that's striking probably to all of us is this conversation could go on for a lot longer. And it's been very rich, but I think it's also a sense that we feel we've just scratched the surface this evening. Just to say that I am really determined that as a college, we don't just have this as a kind of fashionable thing that goes away and that we forget about. I think we've got a real moment of opportunity at the moment. It's made us think a lot, it's made us reflect a lot, it's made me go and find out about the stats for ethnic diversity in Chads. And slightly to my surprise, I found it encouraging rather than discouraging. So in the last 5 years, we've actually become more diverse. This isn't a huge claim, but we've become diverse at a slightly faster rate than the university. Now that's not a big thing, but it shows that some of the things that we've been trying to implement have had maybe a small effect. But I think we've got a real moment here. Interesting, the conversation earlier, some of you were a little bit pessimistic and thinking, okay, people forget about it, it's just a fashion thing. I absolutely don't want it to be that. And I really enjoyed the conversation I had with some of you a week or two ago. Ivy and some of you were talking about the intersectionality of this. It is all connected. So we've been doing quite a lot of work over the last year or so in terms of first generation students and trying to be much more aware of what is it about our college culture that actually feels exclusive, that isn't inclusive, that invisible barriers. And I think, you know, we've got to combine with that some serious work on where are the invisible barriers in terms of people of colour, you know, and we've started that conversation. And I think that's something that I'm absolutely committed that we carry on with. So one of the things that I would like to come from this evening, if those of you who want to sort of help lead that journey, because obviously a few of us can't do it on our own, it's got to be, you know, a significant college effort. I'd love you to get in touch with me and say, yeah, I'd like to carry on helping us think together as Chads about how we can continue to make a significant difference and use this moment in ways that mean in a year's time, in 2 years' time, we'll be still having these conversations, but we hope that there'll be slightly different ones. We hope there'll be slightly more advanced ones, and we hope we can look back and say, yeah, there has been change. So call me an optimist, but I really do think that's possible. And I've found this conversation tonight to be a really helpful one and a really encouraging one. And I want to thank all of you for coming. It's been a wonderful turnout. On evenings like this, you never know if it's going to be 3 of you in a kind of Zoom chat. Tonight, I think we have more than 50 people, which is really good. I'm sorry, it wasn't 250. But we will record this, we will put it on the website. So hopefully some people can catch up with it later who couldn't actually be here tonight. I'd particularly like to thank the students whose idea this was. Thank you for your wisdom, for your thoughtfulness, for your reflectiveness that's led to this conversation tonight. And I'd also very much like to thank our 3 speakers, so Jake and Anne and Ivy. And it's very clear that you are real experts in the history and the sociology. And each of you, I think, could have spent many hours sharing with us your reflections and thoughts and answering questions. But I think probably over 2 hours is enough for now. So thank you very much, everyone. I think it's been a really interesting and helpful and sometimes challenging event. So if we want to do a little bit of applause, some of you, I'm not quite up to the emojis, but feel free to do that if you'd like. And look forward to seeing you again soon at some future event. Thank you, everyone.